Welcome to Chapter 54, the final chapter, Biodiversity and Conservation Ecology. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to discuss the different levels at which we quantify biodiversity. You should be able to identify the major threats to biodiversity and evaluate the evidence that we have that suggests that loss is occurring on a wide scale. Explain why the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem function is important not only for the ecosystems, but also for humans. And discuss strategies for preserving biodiversity and also ecosystem function. So we can think about biodiversity as a tree of life. Remember, we used this analogy when we were talking about speciation, right? So this tree is describing all the different evolutionary relationships between all forms of life. And each branch represents a lineage of organisms, and then the tips represent the species that are alive on Earth right now. So when we increase biodiversity through speciation, then the tips and then eventually the branches are added. But when we have an extinction event, if we have an extinction of a species, then a tip is removed, or potentially if that species is the last of its lineage, then the entire branch is removed. All right, so what is species richness, what is species diversity, and what is species evenness? Anyone?
Well, species richness is just counting species in a place.
Yeah. What's species diversity?
Yeah, species diversity is when it's like you count them, but you also keep in mind how many individuals of each species you got.
Okay, that's good. That's species diversity. What's species evenness? Oh, that's like whether you have about the same number of individuals of each species or not. Yep, that is correct. Okay. All right. So species diversity, right, is going to depend on the evolutionary and ecological context of the species present in a particular group. So you have some species where, the actual lineage that they comes from is really taxonomically diverse. So if you're looking at a single beetle, there are 360,000 species of beetles. If you're looking at orchids, there are 35,000 species of orchids. But there's other lineages that are species poor. So for example, the red panda of Asia is the only species in its lineage. And so it can be really important to maintain taxonomic diversity, right? But it should also be important to keep in mind which lineages are species poor. So for example, there are 43 different kinds of dogs. So if you lost one species of dog,
No!
well, okay, if you lost one species of dog, there would still be 42 more. But if you lost the red panda, you would lose not only the tip of that branch, but the entire branch. So it's important to think about both the richness of lineages, but also think about the unique ecological roles that each species takes in its community. So we can measure patterns of biodiversity by mapping biodiversity within each cell of a grid. So they've kind of calculated the biodiversity in each cell and then kind of showed this is the number of breeding bird species per cell in the grid. Okay, ranging from 1 to 959. Another way that we can think about identifying places in the world that are important in terms of biodiversity is by looking at endemism. So an endemic species is a species that is found in one very specific area and nowhere else. So this is looking at species richness of birds, right? So you can see there are birds all over the world. There are the most birds over here in the tropics, right? But you can also look at the number of endemic bird species per cell in the grid, and you find a similar pattern that there are the most endemic species here. So like I just said, the tropical rainforests are particularly species rich. Tropical rainforests represent only 7% of the land area of the Earth, but they contain at least 50% of all species present, including endemic species. We can also map biodiversity hotspots on the Earth. So a biodiversity hotspot has a very specific definition. It is a region that has greater than or equal to 1,500 endemic plant species, from which at least 70% of the traditional or primary vegetation has been lost. Okay? So you can see that definition has two components. you have to have a lot of endemic plants, and you have to be in a place where you are losing plants at that point. Okay? So, the kind of a hotspot gives us an idea where you have a lot of endemics, but also where those endemics are at risk. So hotspots represent just 2.3% of the Earth's land area, but they contain over 50% of all known plant species and 42% of all known terrestrial vertebrates. The hotspots are, let's see, hang on a second. And it should be noted that hotspots do not include places like the Amazon, because the Amazon is actually doing okay right now. The Amazon has not lost 70% of its vegetation. I feel like I'm missing a piece of this map. This map is not actually showing hotspots. It is literally just showing you the distribution of biomes, okay? It can be very important to conserve hotspots, but also conserve these other areas, like, the Amazon and Borneo, New Guinea, Madagascar, that have a high proportion of species and endemic species, because that kind of covers areas that have endemics and are at risk, and also areas that have endemics and may be at risk in the future. Okay, so species are becoming extinct faster than at any other time in the history of the Earth. So we already talked about this in an earlier lecture, but the current rate of extinction that we have on Earth right now is between 100 to 1,000 times greater than the background rate of extinction. Do you remember what the background rate of extinction is? Anyone?
Yeah, it's like this stuff goes extinct for its own reasons, like all the time.
Yeah. All right, so if we compare that normal rate of extinction to now, we are still doing terribly. So based on this kind of data, scientists believe we're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction on Earth at the moment. One way that we can classify organisms to determine which ones are more likely to go extinct is by using this kind of International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, red list. So they make categories called vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So we can kind of gather vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered into a single category of threatened. So that's the yellow, orange, and red here. So 13% of bird species are threatened, 26% of mammal species are threatened, and 41% of amphibians are threatened. So amphibians are at much greater risk of going extinct than mammals and that are birds. A species that is known as an endangered species is a species whose numbers have decreased so drastically that it is almost certain to go extinct without effective conservation efforts. So that is what we mean by endangered. Okay? So vulnerable is kind of like they're almost endangered. Endangered means we need to do something. Critically endangered means it may be too late, but we should still try. So why are things going extinct? There are many different kinds of threats that can potentially overlap with one another and interact to affect endangered species. So this is just kind of a graph showing some of the factors that we know about: habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation, pollution, native species interactions, and natural causes. And we're looking at 3 different systems: terrestrial, freshwater, and marine systems. And so this is for Canada. And so they did an analysis on 488 endangered species native to Canada, and they found that in most habitat loss is the most important factor in declines for most areas. Virtually all of the endangered species are affected by more than one factor, though, so it's not a single thing. Some species are suffering from interactions with invasive species, others with overexploitation, etc. So the things that are the biggest problem for marine species tend to be overharvesting. The biggest problem for freshwater species tends to be pollution, as well as habitat loss. They all suffer from habitat loss. And so you can see terrestrial species suffer from a variety of these different things. And there's also the potential for natural causes that are beyond human control that can be important. Natural disasters, fires, volcanoes. I have to talk about volcanoes.
I'm gonna be over here.
Okay. So natural causes can also have negative effects, as can interactions with native species. But these can also interact with other things like habitat loss. So with the loss of habitat, there may be fewer places to go in a natural disaster, and native species may be having more interactions with each other because they have fewer habitats to live in. All right, so name 3 ways that humans destroy habitat.
Carbon dioxide emissions.
Is that destroying habitat?
No, but that's bad.
It is bad. Well, how do we destroy habitat?
We build stuff on top of it. Or we don't, you do. I'm not a human.
Yeah, I know. All right, so yeah, we build things up. What else do we do?
Well, humans will sometimes put chemicals in the ground and the water.
Yeah, that's true. What else?
Sometimes non-native species get distributed places.
Yeah, they can destroy habitat. What else? Sometimes people hunt stuff. Yeah, I mean, if they overhunt it so that it decreases in quantity.
Yeah, they can like overhunt stuff or overfish stuff. I myself like a fish.
Yes, as a cat, I would expect that. So we do things like log and burn forests. We graze livestock, dam rivers and fill in estuaries and wetlands. We excavate minerals for things that we need. We build housing developments and roads as well. So these are some of the major threats to biodiversity, right? Habitat destruction and degradation, overexploitation, introducing invasive species, pollution, and climate change. So globally, deforestation is one of the most important types of habitat destruction. So this basically means just taking a forest and taking the trees out. Forest loss in South America and Africa is especially important because we know that's where biodiversity hotspots are, right? So let's remember we have large numbers of endemic species and also deforestation happening. One thing that these forests can do is they can moderate the effects of climate change by storing carbon. So when you take out the trees, you get more severe effects of climate change. So for example, when you cut down a forest, this can affect actually the cloud formation and precipitation in that particular area. So if you reduce cloud formation and precipitation, soil becomes eroded because of the forest being gone. You get this positive feedback loop where you don't get precipitation and the soil quality is poor, and this can cause rainforests to become a savanna. So it can actually change what biome that area is. We can also have a kind of a deterioration of the quality of habitat called habitat degradation. And you can do this through light pollution or noise pollution, or by breaking up large habitats into tiny little isolated pieces of habitat. And if you take a large habitat and break it up too much, top-level predators are not able to live there. And if you don't have a top-level predator, it can cause a trophic cascade, meaning without the predators, then their prey items may overpopulate the area and eat all of the primary producers, and then that causes the prey items to crash in numbers and the entire ecosystem crashes. If you have a metapopulation, do you remember what a metapopulation is?
Yeah, that's when you have little populations that, like, individuals go back and forth between the little populations.
Yeah. So you could have a species that's not meant to live in a metapopulation structure, that's kind of forced into it. And that can lead you to end up with lots of small isolated populations that are each individually vulnerable to catastrophes. In the individual fragmented populations, you could have inbreeding depression and loss of variation. Do you remember what inbreeding depression is?
Yeah, that's when you have relatives breeding with each other so that you have lots of homozygosity and poorer health.
Yeah. Another thing that fragmentation does is it creates a lot of edge habitat. So if you have a big, large area, if you have a big, large, like kind of round habitat, then you have a lot of inside compared to the edges, right? But if you have a lot of if you take that same area and break it into little pieces, you have a lot more edges compared to the amount of inside that you have. And so edges are kind of their own kind of habitat. They tend to get exposure to harsher conditions, and also a lot of invasive species are specialists on edges. So there has been a long-term experiment in a tropical wet forest to look at the decline in habitat quality caused by fragmentation. So their general question is, how does fragmentation affect the quality of tropical wet forest habitat? Their hypothesis is that fragmentation will reduce the quality of the wet forest habitat. And the null hypothesis is that fragmentation has no effect on the quality of the wet forest habitat. So they have many plots. One is a large unfragmented forest, and then they have different size hectare or different hectare fragments of forest, right? So their prediction is that biomass will decline in forest fragments compared to those in the interior, particularly along the edges of the fragments. The null would be that the biomass will be the same inside the forest fragments and along edges as in the forest interior. So this is what they found here. Somebody want to describe it?
It looks like the edge plots, they lost biomass, and then it kind of levels off.
Yeah. So what do you conclude from that?
I guess it's better not to be in an edge.
Yeah, I guess not. Yeah, so the biomass declined sharply along the edges of the forest fragments. So, yeah, with this, okay, we can review this other bit here too. So you have this initial drop in biomass, okay, near the edges, and the biomass, by comparison, did not decrease in the interior plots. So they also found something which wasn't kind of graphed here, but they found the result that the nearer a plot was to an edge, the more biomass it lost. Okay? All right. So we also talked about overexploitation and invasive species affect biodiversity. When we talk about overexploitation, we are referring to any unsustainable removal of organisms from the natural environment of use by humans. And so this is especially a problem for marine species. 2/3 of harvestable marine species are depleted. So these are like the fish, and the invertebrates that we eat. 90% of individuals of large-bodied fish species from bottom or open water habitats have been harvested. So a lot of these fish, we find out, are actually, they can live to a very old age. And a lot of them don't reach sexual maturity until an old age. So by taking the biggest fish, we're basically taking all the fish that can produce the next generation. And when these fish are gone, they perform a very particular role in their ecosystem, and so taking them out could potentially cause trophic cascades for the entire ecosystem. Overhunting is less of a problem, but it can also be a problem in mammal populations in Africa and also some other places. In some places, people capture animals for the pet trade rather than kind of breeding them. And so that's also a problem. Pollution and climate change also affect biodiversity. So we, as humans, release chemicals into the environment, and we know that some of the industrial pollutants can contribute in our water cycle to cause acid rain. Some interesting cases have found that there are a lot of pharmaceutical drugs in watersheds. So basically people are kind of peeing into toilets, and it's doing things like, I know there's a large project that was being done in the Port of Los Angeles in which they found that, for example, the birth control pills in urine were causing feminization of lots of mollusks. Other things, nutrient runoffs can cause eutrophication. So we already talked about how, like, if you go and produce, nitrogen and phosphorus to use to put on your farmers' fields, that can run off into the water. The water will have algae in it. The algae will overproduce and then choke all the oxygen out for everything else, and then that lake will die. We also have garbage just everywhere. Climate change has lots of effects on species, including extinctions. So right now, both ice caps and glaciers are melting at an unprecedented rate. And there are species that disperse very slowly, like trees, that can't track the changes in climate. So the trees are, the climate's changing too quickly for the trees to be able to have any kind of long-term adaptation, and those trees are dying. And that affects the community composition. So without the trees there aren't places for the other organisms to live. In the oceans, there's a loss of coral reefs. So as the temperature increases, we talked about this when we talked about cnidarians, but you can end up with coral bleaching, right? When the symbionts of the corals can't live there anymore. Also, ocean acidification makes it hard for marine animals to make calcium carbonate skeletons, which we just talked about. Okay, so there's several ways that species richness can have a positive effect on net primary productivity. And so this is just a justification for why, we like the idea that there are lots of species, but having lots of species in an area also just is kind of good ecological sense. So there is an advantage in terms of resource use efficiency. So if you have diverse assemblages of plants, they are more efficient in using all of the resources available to them, so they can actually produce more biomass than if you just have one kind of plant. There's an effect called facilitation. So sometimes you have some species that assist the growth of other species by providing them with benefits. And it could be something very simple, like one species grows a bit tall and makes shade, and then a lot of other species can live underneath it. And there's also sampling effects. And so if you have one or two species that are really productive, your net primary productivity may depend on whether those species happen to be in a study plot. So if you have lots of different kinds of species in a plot, those plots will tend to outproduce low species plots. So I guess basically what it's saying is if you have lots of species, you are better off in terms of you're more likely to get high productivity than if you only have a few species, because you may just not end up with one of the species that you need in a particular area. And these three mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. So all three of these things can have a positive effect on net primary productivity. It is interesting, if you look at long-term experiments, sometimes it'll start out that like having greater species richness will add to net primary productivity, for example, due to facilitation at the beginning, and then later on due to sampling effects or resource use efficiency. Okay, so here's a research project in which people looked at whether high species richness and high functional diversity of species increase aspects of ecosystem function like net primary productivity. So the hypothesis is that net primary productivity increases with increasing species richness and with increasing functional diversity of species. So what's the null?
Net primary productivity doesn't increase with that stuff.
Yeah, okay. So they planted 289 experimental plots, and each plot had up to 32 species and up to 5 functional groups. So these are the functional groups. The plants that they put in here are either cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, woody plants, or forbs. Okay? So this would be different kinds of examples of the plots. You could have just a single species, which only represents a functional group. You could have 2 species that were within the same functional group. You could have like 6 species with 6 different functional groups, right? So they did like lots of different combinations of numbers of functional groups and numbers of species. All right, so if NPP increases with increasing species richness and increasing functional diversity of the species, what do you predict?
Oh, we predict that the plots that have the greater species richness will have higher NPP, and the plots that have increasing functional diversity will have higher NPP.
Yeah, so what's the null?
Nothing, that won't matter.
Okay. How will you measure NPP? Because remember, your prediction has to be something you can actually measure.
I would weigh out the plants, so I calculate out biomass.
Okay. So this is what they found, right? So the plant biomass increases with species richness up into a point, and then you have as much species richness as you can. And plant biomass increases with the number of functional groups that you add. So more functional groups. There's only 5 functional groups total, so it has to end at 5. And yeah. So what do you conclude from that?
I conclude that if you have greater species richness, you get more NPP, and if you have more functional diversity, you have more NPP, but like up to a certain point.
Yeah. So what they found is in this community, NPP increases with increasing species richness and increasing functional diversity of plants, at least up to a certain point where it levels off. All right, so does biodiversity help with stability in a community? When we talk about community stability, we're talking about the ability of a community to recover to former levels of productivity or species richness after a disturbance. And to be able to maintain productivity and other aspects of ecosystem function as conditions change over time. And so we talk about two features of this. Resistance, right, is a measure of how much a community is affected by a disturbance. So this species has low resistance, so they have a disturbance and they're very strongly affected. It goes downhill, right? This species has high resistance, they're affected by disturbance, and they don't decrease in biomass very much. So that's resistance. And then resilience is a measure of how quickly a community recovers after a disturbance. So you can see here, after a disturbance, it's way down here. This community has low resilience, it doesn't bounce back. This community has high resilience, it does bounce back. Right? This one doesn't bounce back, and this one does bounce back. So which one would be the best way to be?
High resilience and high resistance.
Yeah. We know that if you increase species biodiversity, you get an increase in both resistance and resilience. So this is another reason to try and maintain high species richness and diversity. We know that communities that are more diverse appear to be more productive, right? They appear to be more resistant to disturbance and invasion, and they're more resilient than communities that are less diverse. And so if you increase species richness, you also get an increase in the services provided by ecosystems as well. But if these ecosystems get simplified because you have extinctions that kill many of the species in that ecosystem, then the productivity of the entire ecosystem, as well as other attributes like, again, resistance and resilience, is likely to decrease. All right, let's talk a little bit about ecosystem services, right? So these are basically things that ecosystems do for us, okay? And so some examples of types of ecosystem services would be like provisioning services, right? So these are just, ecosystems provide us with raw materials like food, fuel, medicines, and building materials. People will often do what's called bioprospecting. And so they'll go out into the rainforest or new places and look for drugs or ingredients to put into consumer products. There are regulating services. So ecosystems can moderate the climate, keep it more even. They can prevent soil erosion. They can regulate water and carbon dioxide. They can capture water, purify it, air cleaning, flood control, storm mitigation, and waste decomposition. Cultural services include all the different ways that we integrate nature into our lives, and people get a lot of kind of mental health and physical health from nature, as well as other kinds of educational and recreational purposes. There's also supporting services like pollination and pest control, right, that we need, and also, things that interact with other systems. So the bees that are helping an ecosystem may also come over and help pollinate our crops, et cetera, et cetera. All right, there's also an ethical dimension to preserving biodiversity. And so there has been the argument put forward that humans have an ethical obligation to preserve species and ecosystems. And this is based on three basic arguments. First, the argument is that organisms have intrinsic worth, right? So that there's something valuable about all of the organisms that are threatened. Industrialized nations are responsible for most of the environmental harm, and so we need to not inflict hardship on poorer nations, right? So there's an element of fairness here, that we are gaining the benefits of these ecosystems and inflicting the harm on other people. Also, the deprivation of ecosystem services to future generations is unethical, so we are basically using them all up so that future generations do not have them. Okay, so what is the ultimate cause of all of this loss of biodiversity? We know that the two ultimate causes are human population growth and the rate of fossil fuel consumption, okay? So we have or are nearing or have surpassed the Earth's carrying capacity. And so we need to think about sustainability, which is kind of a way to create ways for humans to live off the resources that are being replaced on Earth and not overuse. So this is just showing something you can think about. This is the amount of land use per meter squared per year per 1,000 kilocalories produced by eggs, poultry, pork, beef, and dairy. And also the water used and the greenhouse emissions. So if you're thinking about, for example, doing a small thing, maybe eating more poultry and pork and less beef may potentially help with both land use, water use, and greenhouse emissions. All right, let's hear some other examples. What can you do in your own lives to improve sustainability?
Well, I cannot drive so much.
Well, you're a cat. Can you drive at all?
I could go slash the tires on the car so that nobody else can drive.
I mean, I know you'd enjoy doing that. Okay. What else?
Well, I guess I can eat less beef. I like chicken a lot, though, so it's not much of a loss.
All right, what else?
Well, I can try to make sure that if I have to drive a car or a vehicle, it's a low emission vehicle.
Yeah, that's true. What other things can we do?
We can go try to encourage any businesses to reduce their carbon footprint if we are customers of the business.
Yeah, that's true.
We can make less garbage.
Yeah, you can definitely make less garbage. What else?
Well, I guess we can have less babies.
Okay, well, you're a bird. You can have all the babies you want. Maybe you can encourage humans to have fewer kids.
Yeah, sure, why
not? Okay, so there are lots of conservation strategies that we can do right now to preserve genetic diversity and species diversity and also ecosystem function. And so there's lots of education campaigns to raise public awareness and of conservation efforts and to try to make it so that people do not want to purchase unsustainable products and instead will choose things that add to sustainability. There are not experiments, but there's projects right now to work on genetic restoration to help endangered populations. And so some of the ways that we can do this is create artificial gene flow in endangered species so we can, take animals back and forth between areas so that gene flow happens, even if the animals are unable to get there themselves. Seed banks, so we can save up seeds and use them so that we have genetic diversity in plants. There's actually a kind of a seed repository. I can't remember where it is. I think in the Netherlands, somewhere north. And so, that way if we end up having certain species of plants wiped out, we have seeds available to, repopulate.
That's like in Mad Max Fury Road.
It is like in Mad Max Fury Road. We have management plans to prevent introduction and spread of invasive species. So if you see signs telling you, for example, not to move firewood around because bark beetles will be, emerald ash borers or other beetles will be spread, pay attention to the signs and do the thing. Endangered species are being carefully managed and protected by law. So if you see anyone buying or selling endangered species, you should definitely tell on them because they may just single-handedly that person may single-handedly be having a large impact on the fate of that particular species. All right, so other kinds of strategies, there's ex situ conservation and reintroduction. So this means that some zoos, aquaria, ranches, and botanical gardens will have breeding pairs of endangered species that they will breed up and then reintroduce to the wild. I worked on a project like that. I worked on red wolves, so we had a breeding pair of red wolves. But there's lots of species that are being ex situ conserved like that. In terms of natural environments, there has been a big push for the development of wildlife corridors. And so this is making these strips of undeveloped habitat to connect together protected areas so that you can get gene flow between different patches, and so that's really important. Some of these are very cool and creative, like tunnels that go under highways and bridges over highways for animals of different sizes. Also designing effective protective areas to preserve biodiversity from various impacts. So this is highly successful. So this would mean making an area in which people are not allowed to harvest resources from that area or to hunt for those species. And so most species that need protection are not protected, but we are increasing over time the number of globally protected areas. All right, so this is just summarizing that. Oh yes, it's a picture of one of these very cool wildlife corridors for large animals like this. All right, so there are thousands of ecosystem restoration and reforestation projects happening right now, just waiting for you to get involved. And some of these kind of efforts, you can actually see effects in decades, not centuries, so you can really see changes that have happened due to these restoration projects, so they are working. And it's important to emphasize an ecosystem services approach if we want people to buy into these projects and convince people that our prosperity as humans is going to depend on preserving these ecosystems. We have to protect the ecosystem services, right? So if all of the native bees collapse, we are going to have trouble getting enough pollinators for things. We also know, that replacing an ecosystem service like water filtration or soil erosion can cost 10 to 100 times the cost of protecting them. So we're actually saving money by protecting the ecosystem rather than having to replace the service. Other kinds of strategies rely on ecotourism. So this is the idea that maybe the country that has the resource that needs to be preserved might benefit more in the long term by tourism than in the short term by activities like logging or something like that. All right, so the take-home message is, yes, we are now facing the most serious global environmental crisis in the history of our species, but there are a lot of things we can do to change things. And hopefully a lot of the things that we've learned in this biology class will give us the tools that we can all use to make an important positive impact on the Earth. All right, we are here. So in this chapter, you hopefully were able to learn about biodiversity and then think about the interaction between biodiversity and threats to biodiversity and benefits of biodiversity. We learned about different threats to biodiversity and benefits of biodiversity. And the goal ultimately is to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem function.